Galactic Council declared war on Earth. Humanity's replies shocked the stars. Nathan Cole had been mid-sentence when the Grand Arbiter cut the feed. He had spent 6 years preparing the case he was presenting. 6 years of documentation, legal argument, diplomatic correspondence, and careful, patient negotiation with a body that had never once in those 6 years given him any indication that it was listening in good faith. He had been on slide 42 of 60, making the legal argument for Earth's permanent seat on the Council, when the chamber lights shifted from the amber of an open session to the deep red of a priority override. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Grand Arbiter Korseth, a Velhari elder whose elongated frame occupied a seat that looked more like a throne, raised one long arm, and the room went silent in the way that rooms go silent when something large has already been decided. The decree was read from a prepared document. Nathan could tell because Korseth did not pause once, not to consider a word, not to breathe in the places where Velhari typically breathe during formal speech. Every sentence had been written and approved and sequenced in advance, and the reading of it was not a decision being made but a decision being announced. Earth had been classified as a Tier 1 instability source. Nathan set his presentation pointer down on the table in front of him. He set it down without making a sound, folded his hands over his notes, and listened. The annex of consideration was the largest formal chamber on Velhar Station. Circular, 800 meters across, its terraced walls held the delegations of 212 member species, each section built to the specific requirements of a different biology, a different gravity, a different arrangement of limbs. Some delegations were present in person. Others were rendered as precision light field projections, realistic enough that you could read the expression on a face without knowing the body producing that expression was decades of travel away. Nathan had learned to tell the difference, after 4 years, by the faint delay in blinking that projections always had. He was the only human in the room. He had been the only human in this room for 4 years, and in 4 years he had learned that 212 species watching you with varying degrees of open disdain was not actually as difficult to manage as it sounded, provided you had a clear objective in your head and something to do with your hands. The clear objective helped considerably. The first charge was unauthorized resource extraction. Earth had established mining operations in 11 planetary bodies inside Council-mapped space without prior approval. The Council had sent formal notices. Earth had responded with legal arguments citing provisions in the Council's own founding charter that, when read carefully, did not prohibit what Earth was doing. The Council had sent more notices. Earth had sent more arguments. This had continued for 3 years, with neither side moving. The second charge was infrastructure interference. Earth's deep space relay network, described publicly as a navigation and research asset, had been positioned in a manner the Council claimed disrupted 3 established communication corridors. Earth's engineers had responded that the disruption level fell below the threshold defined in Council Technical Standard 44G and was not therefore a compliance issue. The Council had found this response more aggravating than the first. The third charge took the longest to read. The Council called it deliberate strategic ambiguity. They meant that Earth had, for 3 decades, refused to define the limits of its expansion, the ceiling of its military capacity, or the precise boundary of what it considered its own sovereign territory. Every Council request for a clear answer had received a qualified answer, a carefully worded answer, an answer that was technically accurate and gave away nothing. The Council had concluded correctly that this was deliberate policy. Korseth read the final terms. Earth had 70 galactic hours to submit all military assets to a full Council inspection, disclose the complete record of all exploration and development activity over the past 30 years, accept a formally negotiated ceiling on further expansion, and provide a written acknowledgement of the primacy of Council governance in all matters of galactic order. Failure to comply would result in the Council moving to direct enforcement. The room held still. Nathan looked at the ceiling of the annex, painted in the amber and deep orange of the Velhari home system, a choice made 8 centuries ago by the founders of the council who had also, 8 centuries ago, written the founding charter that Earth's legal team had been citing in its responses for 3 years. He looked back at Korseth. "Grand Arbiter," Nathan said, "I have 3 questions." The shift in the room was immediate. Not loud, not dramatic, but present, the way a change in air pressure is present before a storm. Delegations that had settled into passive attention sharpened. Korseth's coloring moved toward a darker shade. "This is not a question session," Korseth said. "I understand that," Nathan said. "I will be brief." A pause. "Ask them," Korseth said. "First question," Nathan said. "The inspection of military assets. Is the Council's authority to require this derived from the membership charter or from the enforcement protocol?" "The enforcement protocol," Korseth said. "Which applies to member species," Nathan said. "Which applies to all civilizations within Council-mapped space," Korseth said. Second question, the expansion ceiling. Is it set by the Council alone, or does the process include a formal response and negotiation period? A pause. The Council defines initial parameters. A response period follows. Third question, Nathan said. The acknowledgement of primacy. The decree uses the word acknowledge. Does that mean legal recognition as a binding fact or a political declaration? 212 delegations were focused on the human, in a way they had not been focused on anything in this chamber in a very long time. Nathan did not look at them. His attention was on Korseth, because that was where the conversation was, and because a person who looks around a room while asking a difficult question is telling the room they are not entirely sure of themselves. He was sure of himself. Korseth had gone very dark. "These are procedural questions," Korseth said carefully. "They do not constitute a response to the decree." "That is correct," Nathan said. "They are not a response. They are the preparation for one. I need to contact my government before I can deliver a formal reply." He paused. "I need 4 hours." "You have 70 galactic hours," Korseth said. "I only need 4, Nathan said. "I know what they will say, I just need it said on the record." He gathered his tablet and his presentation documents, stood up, and walked toward the main exit. The path took him along the chamber floor beneath the full height of the terraced delegations. 212 species watching a single human walk the length of the room at a pace that communicated nothing, except that he knew where he was going, and had no particular feelings about who was watching. He stepped into the outer corridor and called Secretary General Carol Nand. She picked up immediately. "Nathan," she said. "Tier 1 classification," he said. 70 hours. Full inspection, expansion ceiling, primacy acknowledgement, and complete disclosure of all development activity for 30 years. He heard her exhale, not in fear, in the specific way of a person hearing the final confirmation of something they have been preparing for over a very long time. "Every item on the list," she said. "Every single one," Nathan said. "Then we begin," Carol said. "Go back inside and hold your position. Do not offer anything. Do not signal anything. Let them wait for a surrender." A brief pause. 66 hours, Nathan. Then you walk back in and deliver our answer." "What is our answer?" he asked. "It is not a surrender," she said. The line closed. Nathan stood alone in the white corridor of Velhar Station, looking at the clean, permanent walls of an institution that had not been seriously challenged in 8 centuries. He looked at them for a moment, turned around, and walked back into the annex of consideration. When he returned to the Earth delegation station, the session had not formally resumed. Several holographic delegations had frozen their projections, meaning the beings they represented were in private communication with their home systems. The Velhari advisors behind Korseth's platform were gathered in a tight cluster, speaking in frequencies too low for Nathan's translator to catch. He sat down, opened his tablet, and began reviewing the legal notes he had brought, which were thorough and organized, and which he had no intention of presenting today because today had taken a different direction entirely. 212 species watched the human delegate read his notes, as though the next 66 hours were a matter of routine administration. He supposed, in one sense, they were. Commander Reese Garland's ship did not officially exist. She appeared too. Her registration listed her as GS-7741, a deep space geological survey vessel assigned to the Outer Belt Mapping Program, carrying a crew of 14 and approximately 40 metric tons of drilling equipment. She had submitted 18 months of detailed geological survey reports over the past 2 years, reports that were thorough, peer-reviewed, and entirely real, produced by a research division staffed by people who had no clearance for the other half of the vessel and did not know there was another half. The Meridian was a frigate, 340 meters from stern to bow, built over 10 years in a construction facility on the far side of Callisto under a workforce that rotated every 6 months, and filed quarterly updates to an HR system that described them all as geological survey contractors. Her hull carried a coating that absorbed the electromagnetic frequencies used by Council identification sensors. Her drives were calibrated to produce a power curve that matched a commercial freighter when running below capacity. 3 separate Council monitoring sweeps had processed her drive signature and classified her as a low-priority scientific asset. She was one of 22. Reese had commanded her for 3 years. In that time, he had run 51 readiness drills, navigated 8 live exercises through Council-monitored space without triggering a query, and studied the tactical briefings for an operation that had no public name until 2 months ago, when the Secretary General's office had circulated a document referring to it as Operation Standing Reply. His communications officer, a careful and precise young woman named Fiona Hale, stepped onto the bridge and said his name in the specific tone she reserved for information that required his immediate and undivided attention. "Commander," she said, "authenticated priority signal." He set down the system's diagnostic tablet and followed her. The bridge was already staffed. His crew had developed, over 3 years of preparation, a particular sensitivity to changed conditions that did not require an explicit announcement to activate. Lieutenant Owen Pace was at the tactical station, his hands moving through pre-checks he had not been asked to run. Sergeant Carl Ames had the weapons board open and was running a quiet calibration he had done so many times it was closer to habit than procedure. Navigator Petra Walsh had the jump calculation hold file up on her screen, the one Reese had asked her to keep ready for the past 48 hours. Reese read the activation signal on the primary screen. The Galactic Council had issued a formal decree against Earth, Tier 1 classification, 70-hour deadline, Operation Standing Reply was authorized. All 22 ships were to confirm activation within the hour and deploy at hour 68. He read it once. He read it again. Not because the meaning was unclear, but because some documents are heavy enough that they deserve a second pass before you act on them. He turned to face his crew. They watched him with the readiness that years of preparation produces in people who take their work seriously. Not excitement, not manufactured calm. Simply the focused presence of people who have spent a long time getting ready for something and have just been told it has arrived. "You have been briefed on the operation parameters," Reese said. "The timeline has started. We deploy at hour 68. Until then, full readiness maintenance, all systems on standby warm. No signal traffic outside the secure channel. Questions can be asked now." Nobody asked a question. Carl Ames turned back to the weapons board and began running pre-activation sequences, with the quiet speed of someone whose hands know the work better than their conscious mind does. Petra Walsh locked the jump coordinates into the navigation hold. Fiona opened the secure fleet channel to verify that all 22 ships had received the signal. Reese left the bridge and walked the ship. He did this before every significant drill, so the crew would not read anything unusual into it. He walked from the bridge through the main corridor, through the engineering bay, through the weapons module, through the crew quarters section, and back up through the secondary passage. 20 minutes, most of the ship. He was not looking for mechanical faults. Those were covered by the diagnostic systems. He was checking the thing the diagnostic systems could not reach. What he found at every station was the same. A crew that was not performing readiness but simply doing the work of it, in the specific manner of people who have been ready for a long time and are now in the last stretch before the thing they prepared for begins. He stopped in the engineering bay to speak with his chief engineer, a compact and technically precise woman named Pat Bellows, who was running a final calibration on the experimental close-range system listed on the official manifest as a backup navigation array. "Final status?" Reese asked. Pat looked up from her screen. "Better than the last drill. The interference pattern has extended by 8% across the target frequency range. Whatever targeting protocol their ships use to establish a lock, this should push the full recalibration time to somewhere between 35 and 50 seconds. Reese considered what 35 seconds meant inside a close engagement. "That is more than enough," he said. "I know," Pat said without drama. "That is why I built it to those parameters." He returned to his cabin and slept 6 hours with the focused efficiency of a person who has learned that rest before an operation is not a comfort but a requirement. He woke at hour 58, ran a final systems review with the full crew on the bridge, and spent the remaining hours in preparation that was quieter than any of the drills had been, because this was the real thing and real things have a particular texture that drills cannot reproduce. He thought about the compliance fleet, which Council intelligence placed at the boundary of Earth's solar system. 340 vessels in the standard formation the Council had used for 8 centuries of enforcement operations. He knew that formation in detail. He understood its strengths. He understood its assumptions, which were the more important thing to understand, because assumptions are what a system cannot see around. The formation had been designed to position overwhelming force at the threshold of a target civilization's home system, close enough to make the scale of it undeniable and the cost of resistance obvious. It had worked every single time it had been deployed, not because the civilizations it was deployed against were weak, but because those civilizations had made a rational calculation. They had weighed the force against the value of continued resistance and found the math unfavorable. It was a good model. It described exactly what rational beings did when the cost of a thing exceeded what the thing was worth. What the model had never encountered was a civilization that had spent 10,000 years deciding, collectively and repeatedly, that some things had no ceiling on their value, not out of irrationality, out of a very long and very specific education in what happened when you accepted that ceiling. The lesson had been paid for at great cost and had not been forgotten. The compliance fleet was positioned to make resistance look expensive. The 22 ships of Operation Standing Reply were positioned to make the alternative look worse. At hour 68, the fleet-wide deployment confirmation came through the secure channel. 22 acknowledgments in sequence, each one a different ship and a different crew that had arrived at this moment through the same years of hidden preparation. Reese looked at his crew. "Navigation," he said. "Execute on my mark." He took one even breath. "Mark," he said. The drives engaged with a vibration that started in the floor and moved upward through the full length of the hull, a deep physical thing that was technically identical to 51 previous drills and entirely different in every way that could not be measured. The meridian jumped. The stars outside the forward screen stretched and compressed in the way that jump transit always appeared from inside. 30 seconds later, when the screen cleared and the stars resolved back to points, Reese looked at what was in front of them. The compliance fleet was exactly where the briefing files said it would be, in exactly the formation every tactical document had described, arranged with the precision of an institution that had performed the same deployment so many times it had become reflex. Owen Pace spoke from the tactical board, his voice level and clear. All 22 confirmed in position, fleet integrity intact, experimental systems are active. A brief pause. They are running initial identification scans. We have approximately 40 seconds before their systems resolve our drive signatures as non-commercial. Reese leaned forward in the command chair. We will not wait 40 seconds, he said. Nathan returned to the annex of consideration, with 2 hours and 40 minutes remaining on the deadline. The chamber was fuller than it had been during the decree reading, which surprised him. He had expected some thinning of attendance, species quietly withdrawing as the deadline approached, and the conclusion seemed inevitable. Instead, there were more projection feeds than usual, more physical delegations, more aides pressed into the upper observation galleries. A development large enough to affect 212 species had the same effect as a significant event in human politics. Everyone wanted to be present to see how it resolved. He walked to the Earth delegation station, sat down, and set his tablet on the table without opening it. Grand Arbiter Korseth called the session to order. Ambassador Cole, Korseth said, the Council is prepared to receive Earth's formal response to the decree. The Earth delegation is prepared to deliver it, Nathan said. Does Earth accept the terms as stated? The phrasing was precise. Not what is Earth's response, but does Earth accept? A question shaped to make the expected answer feel like the natural one. Earth does not accept the terms as stated, Nathan said. The room shifted. 212 delegations received the same information simultaneously, and the collective effect of that many minds registering something unexpected had a physical quality. It moved through the chamber like a pressure change before weather. Then what is Earth's position? Korseth said, and Nathan noted with the attention he paid to these things that Korseth's phrasing had moved off the formal template. The Grand Arbiter was improvising. Nathan opened his tablet. He read from it, not because he needed the text, but because reading from a physical record in a formal session carries a specific message. It says the words being spoken were written and approved through a deliberate process. It says this is not improvisation. It says the document exists and will continue to exist after this session ends. He said first that Earth acknowledged every factual item in the decree. The resource operations were real. The relay network was positioned as described. The 3 decades of qualified responses to Council inquiries were deliberate policy. Earth did not dispute the record. He said, second, that Earth rejected the legal framework applied to those facts. The enforcement protocol cited in the decree applied to civilizations that had agreed to Council governance. Earth had not agreed to Council governance. Earth had been placed within Council map space, a designation applied unilaterally without Earth's participation, and had been subject to Council notices, restrictions, and ultimately a decree, through no process in which Earth had ever had the opportunity to accept, decline, or negotiate the authority behind those instruments. He said, third, that Earth was prepared to negotiate. He paused there, briefly and deliberately, because the word negotiate was doing significant work and deserved to land before the next sentence qualified it. He said that Earth was prepared to negotiate a formal relationship based on equal standing, full membership with voting rights, access to Council information and infrastructure on the same terms as any other member species, legal recognition of Earth's sovereignty over its current and future development activities, retroactive to the date of first confirmed contact between human vessels and Council-monitored space. He set the tablet down. "That is Earth's response," he said. Korseth did not speak immediately. Nathan counted 5 full seconds of silence, which was a long silence in a formal session of this kind. "Ambassador Cole," Korseth said at last, "you are aware that the Council's compliance fleet is positioned at the boundary of your solar system." "I am aware," Nathan said, "and that the 70-hour compliance deadline has now expired." "It has," Nathan said, "and that the Council's enforcement protocol provides for immediate action upon the expiration of a non-compliance deadline." "I have read the protocol," Nathan said. "I note that the protocol also provides for a suspension of enforcement action during active diplomatic engagement between a Council representative and a target civilization's official delegate. I am an official delegate. We are engaged diplomatically." A pause. "Unless the Council wishes to dispute that characterization." Korseth had gone very dark. A delegation from the far left tier rose. It was a small species Nathan had identified as the Thurin, who occupied a single seat in the second level and had never spoken in any session Nathan had attended. Its translator was a device worn at the throat. "The Thurin delegation," it said, in a voice that was quiet but carried cleanly in the silent room, "requests clarification on the legal basis for the enforcement protocol's applicability to a civilization that has not ratified the membership charter." The room absorbed this. Another delegation raised its communication indicator. Korseth acknowledged it. The Orvan Collective, a multi-being species that shared a joint decision structure and spoke through a single designated voice. The Orvan delegation also requests clarification. Specifically, whether the Council holds a record of Earth having been offered formal membership prior to the issuance of enforcement directives. Nathan kept his expression neutral. He knew what these questions meant. He had been told, through sources he would not name in this room, that there were species in this Council who had been waiting for a moment when the legal inconsistency in the enforcement protocol became impossible to ignore in an open session. The protocol had been applied selectively for decades to small civilizations with no capacity to contest it. The questions that should have been asked had not been asked because there was no incentive to ask them. The incentive had just arrived. Then the communications alert sounded on the secondary display systems around the chamber, not from Nathan's equipment, from the Council's own monitoring network, which had flagged a significant change in the sensor data incoming from the boundary of Earth's solar system. The compliance fleet was no longer in formation. Nathan looked at the screens along with everyone else. The data was in the Council's own tactical notation, processed by the Council's own systems, unmodified by any human input. 22 unidentified vessels had appeared inside the compliance fleet's formation boundary. Not at the edge. Inside, well within the minimum safe distance that every Council tactical reference listed as an inviolable operational zone. The sensor returns on the unidentified vessels were inconsistent, cycling between several different classification types, which Nathan knew meant that Pat Bellow's experimental system was functioning exactly as designed. The compliance fleet was not responding in any coherent direction. Nathan watched the display with genuine attention because he wanted to understand what was happening and not simply perform watching it. Then he looked back at Korseth. "Grand Arbiter," he said, "I believe Earth's response is now complete in all its parts." Korseth was looking at the display screen with all 4 eyes fully open, which in Velhari physiology was not a resting state. It was the expression of a being processing something for which no prepared response existed. The Thurin delegate was still standing. The Orvan delegation had not withdrawn its request for clarification. A third species, the Sellas, who had been present in this Council for 6 centuries and had never publicly deviated from the Velhari majority position on anything, raised its communication indicator. Korsath acknowledged it. The Cella's delegation, the Cella's delegate said carefully, supports the request for clarification. We note that the founding charter's third article guarantee of consideration for eligible civilizations is not qualified by membership status. It applies to any civilization capable of deep-range transit and deliberate interstellar communication. We believe Earth meets that definition, and would like the record to reflect that this question has been formally raised. On the screen, the compliance fleet continued its very difficult afternoon. Korsath called for a procedural pause. Nathan accepted it with a slight nod, settled back in his chair, and waited. He thought about Reese Garland and 22 ships that had spent years being something other than what their registrations said. He thought about 51 drills run in the dark. He thought about the particular quality of work that people do when they know the stakes are real and the preparation has to be complete. The gap between preparation and the moment it is needed always feels longer than it actually is. He had learned that 4 years ago and was still learning it now. He was entirely prepared to keep waiting. My name is Sylvia Grant, and I had been awake for the better part of 3 days. This was not unusual for me during significant events. I had been awake for 4 days during the initial first contact protocols, when the Council's first official transmission reached Earth's monitoring network, and 20 years of carefully managed non-response became permanently unsustainable. I had been awake for 3 days when Earth's legal team filed its first formal challenge to the Council's enforcement protocol application. My assistant, a methodical young man named Ted Morse, had learned to bring coffee without being asked, and to deliver urgent information in a tone that reached through exhaustion without startling, which is a harder skill than it sounds, and which I valued more than I had ever told him. I was the Director of Strategic Analysis at the UN Council Coordination Office, which was the official name for the department that had, since its founding 18 years ago, been doing the unglamorous and essential work of understanding what the Galactic Council was actually capable of, and comparing that against what it believed itself to be capable of, which were two different things in ways that mattered enormously. The monitoring board showed the current status of the engagement at Earth's outer system boundary. Ted had been providing me with plain language summaries every 15 minutes for the past 6 hours, so I had the picture clearly without needing to read the tactical notation. What I was thinking about, while the board updated, was not the engagement itself but the thing that had made it possible. Because the engagement, to an outside observer, was a military event, it had ships and formations and decisions, and outcomes measurable in position and force. But what I had spent 18 years learning was that military events are almost never primarily military. They are industrial events, economic events. They are the visible surface of a process that began years or decades earlier in places no one was watching. The Council had not watched the right places. Their intelligence operations on Earth had been extensive. I had the complete file. 17 confirmed monitoring programs over 60 years, covering broadcast networks, official communications, publicly registered vessels, and declared research programs. Within the boundaries of what they were looking for, the work had been thorough. The problem was what they had not thought to look for. Every spacefaring civilization in the Council's records had followed a common developmental pattern. Consolidate the home system. Establish primary infrastructure. Expand outward in a declared and registered sequence visible at every stage. They did this because the Council's framework rewarded declared development and restricted undeclared development, and every civilization that had joined the Council had naturally adopted that framework as their operational model. Earth had not joined the Council. Earth had received the Council's framework as a set of external restrictions imposed without consent, reviewed those restrictions carefully, and made a series of decisions that any industrial historian would recognize as entirely logical, and that the Council's analysts had apparently not modeled at all. Where the Council expected declared programs, Earth had built declared programs that were exactly what they appeared to be and nothing else. Where the Council expected registered vessels, Earth had registered exactly the vessels it was prepared to have known about. Where the Council expected transparent development, Earth had produced transparent development in the locations it knew were being monitored. Everywhere else, it had done something quite different. Ted brought me a new update. I read it. The compliance fleet was operating at significantly reduced formation coherence. The experimental close-range systems on the 22 ships were performing above projected parameters. The fleet's recalibration time was running longer than the worst-case estimate in our models, which meant either Pat Bellow's system was working better than designed, or the fleet's equipment was older than our intelligence suggested, or both. I set the update down and went back to the industrial capacity question, because that was the thread I needed to pull. The 22 ships were the visible part of the answer. They were what had been revealed today and what would, from this point forward, be the center of the story this event produced. But the 22 ships were themselves the product of something much larger, something that had been running in parallel with Earth's official industrial activity for a very long time. Callisto had been the primary construction site for the frigate program. The facility there had been declared as a deep space geological research station and had produced 18 years of research output that was real, because the research division was real and was staffed by people who had no clearance for the rest of the facility and did not know the rest existed. This required a level of operational compartmentalization that was genuinely difficult to sustain across years, and the people who had sustained it deserved considerably more recognition than they would ever receive publicly. But Callisto was only one site. There were 11 others. The lunar facility had produced components. The Mars orbital platform had produced propulsion systems. 4 asteroid belt installations, all declared as mining operations, had produced raw materials processed to specific tolerances. The entire supply chain had been managed through a logistics network that, viewed from outside, looked like the ordinary commercial traffic of a growing industrial civilization, because it was ordinary commercial traffic, carrying real goods between real facilities, the goods simply not being the goods listed on the manifests, and the facilities not being only what they were declared to be. The Council's entire model of Earth's military capacity had been built from declared assets. The declared assets were real and were, in every case, accurately recorded. They were simply not the complete picture, and the Council had assumed that a declared asset list from a civilization it was monitoring closely was a complete picture, because that was how every other civilization it monitored behaved. It was a reasonable assumption. It had never been wrong before. The problem with a reasonable assumption that has never been wrong is that you eventually stop testing it. Ted put a fresh coffee on my desk. I thanked him and went back to the board. The compliance fleet's port formation quadrant had lost structural coherence. 14 vessels had broken from assigned positions. 3 had initiated communication blackout protocols, which the Council's own tactical manuals listed as a procedure used when a vessel's command authority was uncertain. Command authority uncertain. I wanted to be precise. In the documentation I was already drafting about this event, about what the 22 ships were actually doing, because the story would be told as a military confrontation, and the military framing would miss the most important element. The 22 ships were not trying to overpower the compliance fleet. They were doing something far more specific. They were making the fleet's command structure unable to function as a coordinated unit. There is a significant difference between defeating a force and making a force incoherent. Defeating a force requires matching or exceeding its total capacity. Making a force incoherent requires only disrupting its coordination, and coordination is the specific mechanism that converts individual vessels into an effective fleet. Pat Bellow's experimental system had not destroyed the compliance fleet's targeting arrays. It had extended their recalibration time to the point where the synchronized engagement doctrine the fleet depended on could not be executed. Without the doctrine, the formation did not function. Without the formation, 340 vessels became 340 separate and uncoordinated problems rather than one organized threat, and the Council's fleet had never needed to operate outside its doctrine because nothing in 8 centuries had required it to. The doctrine had always worked. That was both its great strength and its complete blind spot. My phone rang. Carol Nand. "Sylvia," she said, "I need your assessment for the record." "The fleet will not recover formation coherence within the next 3 hours," I said, "when the experimental system begins cycling for power conservation, which Pat Bellows estimated at approximately the 2-hour mark. Their targeting will restore. But by then, the pattern of the engagement will be established, and their command staff will know they are not in a scenario their doctrine covers." I paused. The psychological effect of that on a force that has never operated outside doctrine is significant. "How significant?" Carol asked. I thought about it. An 800-year winning record produces an enormous amount of institutional confidence, I said. Under normal conditions, that confidence is a genuine operational strength. Under conditions that fall outside the prepared range, it becomes a liability, because the trained response to something outside the model is to apply the model harder rather than to abandon it. Their command staff will attempt the doctrine again. That will not produce the expected result. At some point, the leadership will recognize that the doctrine is the wrong tool. That realization, in an institution that has not had to make it in 8 centuries, does not come quickly. "And the second reserve fleet?" Carol asked. "Will be authorized within 48 hours, I said. Escalation is the next step in the prepared sequence. When the compliance fleet fails to produce results, the reserve fleet is the prepared answer. I looked at the board. We planned for this. "We did," Carol said. "I know we did. I just need to hear it out loud from someone who has thought about it longer than I have." "We planned for the complete response," I said. "The 22 ships were never the ceiling. The preparation was for the full sequence, including everything that follows the first escalation and the second." "Good," Carol said. "How are you holding up?" "Ted is keeping me in coffee," I said. "I am holding up fine." She laughed briefly. "Go sleep when you can." "When this is done," I said. The call ended. I turned back to the board. I made a note in my analysis log. "The Council's fundamental error," I wrote, "was in treating Earth's declared capacity as the whole of Earth's capacity. A civilization that maintains extensive undeclared programs alongside its declared ones is not a civilization that is hiding something out of deception. It is a civilization that has learned, at great cost and over a very long time, that announcing your full capability to a more powerful body that has not yet decided whether your existence is acceptable is not transparency. It is an invitation to be managed before you are ready to resist being managed." I underlined the final clause. Outside the windows of the UN Crisis Command building in Geneva, the city was beginning its morning. Traffic, voices, the particular layered sound of a place full of people who knew something enormous was happening 40 astronomical units away, and had decided without discussion that the day was worth continuing regardless. There is a kind of courage in that which is very difficult to explain to someone who did not grow up inside it. It is not ignorance and it is not denial. It is a decision, made individually by millions of people at the same moment, that ordinary life is worth carrying forward regardless of what surrounds it. I thought the Galactic Council had made a significant error in leaving that out of every model they had ever built about us. I finished my coffee and went back to work. The formal resumption of the session came 22 hours after the procedural pause. In those 22 hours, the Council had authorized its second reserve fleet. 720 vessels, the primary long-range enforcement capability, ordered to proceed to Earth's solar system at standard cruise, 41 hours out. The Council had not announced this publicly, but Earth's monitoring network had processed the authorization signal, and Nathan had received the confirmation from Carol Nan 6 hours into the pause. He had sat with that number for about 30 seconds. Then he had thought about Sylvia Grant's analysis, which he had reviewed in full detail in the weeks before this session, and the 30 seconds passed, and he went back to work. He had spent the remaining hours sleeping 4 hours, eating twice, and reviewing the Accord draft that Carol's legal team had been preparing for 3 years and updating continuously for the past 22 hours to reflect the legal questions that had been raised on the floor of the annex. The draft was detailed, specific, and built on a legal foundation that had been researched and reinforced over years by people who had understood that the document, if it ever needed to be used, would be argued over by 212 species for a very long time. He walked into the annex with the latest version on his tablet. The chamber had changed again. Several physical delegations had withdrawn to projection attendance, or had reduced their projection fidelity, which was a way of being present without fully committing to presence. Nathan recognized this as a political positioning signal. Species that were uncertain about which side of the outcome they wanted to be formally associated with were giving themselves room to adjust. The Thurin delegate was still present in person. Small, pale, translator at its throat, in the same seat in the second tier it had occupied in every session. The Orving Collective's voice was present. The Cella's delegation was present. Nathan had noted that in the 22-hour pause, all three had made contact with the Earth delegation's legal staff to request access to the full text of Earth's membership application, citing the third article questions raised in the previous session. The request had been granted immediately. There was one delegation Nathan had not expected to see in person. The Farath, who had been council members for 3 centuries and who had never, in Nathan's 4 years of attendance, registered any public position that was not in exact alignment with the Velhari majority. Their delegate was present today and had arranged its communication indicators in the active position. That was a significant development. Korseth took the central position. The platform was still, as it had been during the previous session. Korseth looked across the room and then looked at Nathan. "This session is reconvened," Korseth said. "The Council has reviewed the situation at the Sol system boundary. The compliance fleet is undergoing tactical reassessment." A pause. "The Council's second reserve fleet has been authorized for deployment." Nathan nodded once. "The Council reaffirms the terms of the original decree," Korseth said. "Earth has not met the compliance deadline. The enforcement process will proceed." "The Earth delegation acknowledges the Council's position," Nathan said. "The Earth delegation's position remains as stated in the formal reply delivered during the previous session." "The Council does not accept Earth's stated position," Korseth said. "I understand," Nathan said. "I have a question." Korseth's coloring shifted. "Ask it," Korseth said. "The Council's founding charter," Nathan said, "in its original Velhari text, uses the phrase equal consideration for all civilizations capable of deep-range transit and deliberate interstellar communication. That language comes from the third article, second section." He looked up from his tablet. "Earth has been capable of deep-range transit for 31 years. Earth has been capable of deliberate interstellar communication, by the Charter's definition, for longer than that. The Charter provides a guarantee of equal consideration. I am asking the Council, formally and on the record, whether that guarantee was extended to Earth at any point prior to the current session." The room was completely still. Korseth did not answer immediately. The Thurin delegate rose from its seat. "The Thurin delegation," it said, "has reviewed the Council's formal records and cannot locate any document in which the guarantee described in the Charter's third article, second section, was offered to or received by the Earth delegation. Its voice was quiet and very clear. The Thurin delegation requests that this be formally clarified and entered into the session record. The Orvin voice followed without waiting to be recognized. The Orvin delegation notes the same absence and supports the Thurin request for clarification. We add that the third article guarantee carries no membership prerequisite in its text. It applies to eligible civilizations. Whether Earth is eligible by the Charter's own definition is a factual question with an answer, and the Orvin delegation believes that answer is yes. The Celas delegate spoke. The Celas delegation supports the position of the Thurin and Orvin delegations. We note further that the enforcement protocol was applied to Earth before the third article question was addressed, and we wish to formally register concern about that sequence. Korseth received a private communication through the device at its wrist. It read it with no visible change of expression. Then the Farath delegate raised its indicator and waited to be recognized. Korseth acknowledged it. The Farath delegation, the delegate said, in a voice that had the quality of words prepared carefully over a long period and now being delivered without hesitation, has considered the legal questions raised across the past 2 sessions and has concluded that the Council's application of the enforcement protocol to Earth is inconsistent with the third article guarantee in the founding charter. The Farath delegation wishes to formally register this conclusion on the session record. The Farath had been council members for 3 centuries. They had never once registered a formal dissent. Nathan kept his expression entirely neutral. He was aware, and wanted to be honest in his own private accounting, that what was happening in this room was not entirely the product of Earth's actions. The legal questions were real. They had always been real. Species that had never had a sufficient opening to raise them had held them for decades, and the Thurin's question had not been spontaneous. It had been prepared by a species that had been waiting for a moment when asking it would produce something other than being dismissed. Earth had provided that moment, but the frustration and the questions had existed long before Earth's ships appeared at the outer system boundary. Korseth called for a second procedural suspension to allow for private consultations among the Council's senior members. Nathan accepted it with the same nod he had used before, settled back in his chair, and waited. The suspension lasted 9 hours. When it ended, Korseth returned to the central position with a formality that Nathan recognized as the formality of someone who had arrived at a position through compromise rather than conviction. The coloring was pale, the Velhari state that followed a hard internal negotiation. Not defeat, not quite, but the particular emptied-out quality of a decision that cost something to reach. The Council, Korseth said, has agreed to enter into formal negotiations with the Earth delegation regarding the application of the Founding Charter's third article to Earth status. Nathan looked at Korseth carefully. To be precise about the language, Nathan said, the Council is agreeing to negotiate Earth's membership under the third article guarantee. Under the third article, yes, Korseth said. The terms, including the retroactive question, remain subject to negotiation. The Earth delegation accepts that framework, Nathan said. We are prepared to begin immediately. The negotiations took 16 hours. They were the most demanding 16 hours Nathan had spent in 4 years on Velhar Station, which was a significant bar. Every clause in the Accord draft was argued. Every argument was conducted in the specific manner of people who understood that the document being written would be referenced by 212 species for a very long time, and that the precision of its language could not be recovered after the fact. Nathan's counterpart in the negotiations was not Korseth, but the Council's chief legal architect, a Velhari named Toreth who was somewhere in the vicinity of 250 years old, and who had the quality of a mind that had been engaged in careful argument for most of a very long life, and found it not exhausting but clarifying. Nathan respected Toreth considerably. Toreth argued honestly from the text, from the precedent, without posturing. When Nathan made a point that was correct, Toreth acknowledged it without resistance and moved to the next issue. When Toreth made a point that was correct, Nathan did the same. They did not agree on everything. The retroactive clause was reduced in scope. The implementation timeline for several equal-standing provisions was extended. The resource extraction operations would require a joint review process rather than immediate full authorization. Nathan had modeled these compromises in advance and understood their boundaries. He accepted what he had planned to accept and held what he had planned to hold. When the final text was confirmed, the core of every position Earth had stated in its formal reply was intact. Full membership with voting rights, legal recognition of sovereignty over current development activities, no inspection of military assets, no expansion ceiling, no primacy acknowledgement. Everything that mattered was in the document. The Accord of Equal Standing was signed at 18 minutes past midnight, Velhar Station time. Nathan signed for Earth. Korseth signed for the Council. Toreth witnessed. 7 additional delegations, led by the Thurin, the Orving, the Sellas, and the Ferath, added their formal support registrations to the session record for inclusion as an appendix. Nathan sat back and looked at the document on his tablet. 12 pages of dense legal text in 17 simultaneous formats. In the most direct terms he could find, it was an acknowledgement that Earth existed and mattered, and would be treated accordingly by the oldest governance structure in the known galaxy. That was what 6 years had been for. Korseth stepped down from the platform and crossed the chamber floor. Nathan stood up. They stood at approximately equal height, because the Earth delegation station floor was slightly elevated relative to the main floor, an arrangement Nathan had made 4 years ago and had never mentioned. Ambassador Cole, Korseth said. The coloring had settled into a mid-range shade Nathan did not have a clear reading on, which was unusual after 4 years of careful attention. I want to ask you something directly. Go ahead, Nathan said. The ships, Korseth said. They were built over years without disclosure. All of this was prepared long in advance of any decree. Yes, Nathan said. Then you knew this moment was coming. Nathan thought about how to answer that honestly. We did not know the decree would come at this specific time, he said. We did not know its exact form, but we understood the general direction events were moving. He paused. We have a long history of understanding that things are moving toward a point before they arrive there. It is a skill that develops through repetition, and we have had considerable repetition. And the preparations, Korseth said, were they made because your species wanted this confrontation? No, Nathan said, without hesitation. They were made because we did not want to reach a confrontation unprepared. We did not know how this would end. We prepared so that it could end well regardless of the path it took, and so that we would still be standing and arguing at the end of it. He paused. We are very committed to still being standing and arguing. Korseth's coloring shifted slowly through several shades. We made significant errors in our assessment of your species, Korseth said. You made one significant error, Nathan said. You looked at what we declared and assumed it represented the whole of what we were. We never told you it was the whole. You assumed. A long pause. That, Korseth said, is a fair statement. Nathan looked around the chamber. Most delegations were still present, the room carrying the atmosphere of a space where something has been completed, not the end of a crisis, but the end of a process that had a clear beginning, and had now arrived at a resolution that would be argued about for decades. He was glad to have been here for it. He was also genuinely ready to go home. Grand Arbiter, he said, I have one more question, and this one is personal. Korseth's 4 eyes focused on him fully. What do you think comes next? Nathan asked. Between your council and my species, what do you actually believe happens now? Korseth was quiet for a moment. The coloring moved through several slow shades. I think we will argue, Korseth said at last. considerably and for a long time, about the meaning of clauses in documents we have just written, about boundaries, about resources, about the pace and limit of your expansion. I think your species will push every provision we have agreed to as far as its language permits, and I think we will push back, and I think the result will be neither exactly what your species wanted nor what ours expected, and that it will nonetheless be better than where we were this morning. Nathan looked at Corsath. That, he said, is the most accurate prediction anyone has made about us in 4 years. Something moved through Corsath's coloring. Not laughter exactly, but in the direction that laughter lives, the small involuntary acknowledgement that two very different beings have, for a moment, understood each other without needing the words to be more precise. Perhaps, Corsath said, we understand each other slightly better now than we did at the start of this session. Slightly, Nathan said, it is a start. He picked up his tablet, tucked it under his arm, and walked the length of the annex of consideration one final time, past 212 delegations, through the main entrance, and out into the corridor. He called Carol Nand. She answered before the first signal ended. It is signed, he said. Full membership, third article basis. Voting rights, sovereignty recognition, no inspection clause, no expansion ceiling, no primacy acknowledgement. Silence just for a moment. Everything, she said. Everything, he said. He heard her exhale. He heard, behind her, the sound of the operations floor registering the news, the particular sound of a room full of people releasing something they have been carrying for a very long time. Come home, Nathan, Carol said. I am on my way, he said. He stood in the white corridor of Velhar Station for a moment after the call ended. In the annex of consideration behind him, 212 species were doing what they always did after a significant session, conferring and calculating and beginning the long work of adjusting to a change in the structure of the world they shared. Somewhere in the outer solar system, 22 ships that had spent years being something other than what their registrations described were ending an engagement with a fleet that had not expected to need to end an engagement in 8 centuries. Somewhere in Geneva, Sylvia Grant was updating her analysis log, and Ted Morse was making coffee. Nathan thought about the document he had just signed, about the children who would grow up in a world where that document was already history, where the argument for Earth's seat at the table was something that had already been settled before they were born, where the starting point was already somewhere further forward than where he had spent 6 years working toward. He thought about his grandfather, who had looked at the night sky from a farmhouse in Cornwall and told a 10-year-old Nathan that everything up there was either waiting to be found or waiting to find us, and that either way the correct response was to be ready. They had been ready. Not because they had been certain of the outcome. He wanted to be clear about that in his own accounting, because certainty and readiness are different things, and confusing them is a mistake that leads to bad preparation. They had not been certain. They had been thorough and patient, and unwilling to accept the ceiling that someone else had decided should be placed over them, and they had kept working at the problem until the problem became something they could answer. He walked toward the transit bay, toward the shuttle, toward the long journey home, through a station that had been built by a civilization that had not expected him to last long enough to reach this corridor, and who would now, by the document he had just signed, have to make a permanent place in their framework for a species that had no intention of being quiet about it. He thought they would manage. He thought, given time and sufficient argument, they might even find it interesting. The transit bay was ahead. Through its windows, the stars of the Velhari system were visible, sharp and cold and ancient. The same stars that had been visible through the ceiling of the annex of consideration, watching every decision made in that room as the architects intended. Nathan looked at them for a moment. He had spent 4 years in a building designed to make those stars feel like witnesses to something enormous and permanent. He had found them impressive in his first session and grown accustomed to them over the following years, until they were simply part of the room. Looking at them now, from the corridor, through the transit bay window, on the far side of a signed document that had taken 6 years and a great deal of effort and no small amount of hidden shipbuilding to produce, he found them impressive again. Not because they were watching, because they were still there, the same as they had always been, and so was he. He walked into the transit bay and got on the shuttle home.